When it comes down to it, what we all want to do is we want to predict what's going to happen in Rahu and Ketu's dashas. And everything we've talked about in all the other Rahu Ketu classes really come down to just that, trying to find out what's going to happen when a person's running Rahu and Ketu. And that's always going to be something important. These periods are usually very life-changing, especially Rahu Dasha. You know, Rahu Dasha is always just the most life-changing in most cases. And you'll find so many people coming to you as an astrologer during Rahu Dasha, because that's when things seem the most out of control and the most unfamiliar, and where the people have the most concerns, because it's so hard when someone's in Rahu Dasha to have any feel for what's going to happen. Surprisingly, even though Ketu dashas are really important, you won't see as many people coming to you as an astrologer running Ketu dasha. It almost seems like when Ketu dasha is running, people just have a better sense about what's going on and what's happening, and it feels more right to them. So there's less need for them to freak out and go see an astrologer. But in Rahu dasha, it's the opposite. So expect to see a lot of Rahu dashas as you read charts. So the place to start with predicting Rahu and Ketu is to isolate the important antardashas. What periods in Rahu and Ketu do I really need to pay attention to? What periods are going to be the ones where a person's life really changes and the important things really happen? That's what we have to figure out. So certain antardashas will do that. And of course, in some varga, somewhere, every antardasha is going to be important. So you always have to look at all the vargas to see it all. But by focusing on the Rashi first, we can get an idea of where the biggest life-changing things will be happening. Because the Rashi chart, of course, is the path your life is on. And the things that Rahu and Ketu are stirring up in that chart will tend to be the things where you have the biggest shifts in your life. But you also have changes that are important that are going to be indicated in the other vargas. So ideally you should look at all of them. Okay, but the important antardashas. The antardasha of Rahu or Ketu's lord is always going to be important. Remember, Rahu and Ketu give the effects of their lords. So in Rahu, in the antardasha of its lord, the full effects of Rahu's position is going to be happening. Okay, the full effects of that lord is going to happen. And usually in a very important way. Okay? You want to check that in any vargas that are pertinent to your client's life or that you want to look at. If you have time, you can check it in all of the vargas. But the lord that Rahu or Ketu's lord is always going to be a really important varga. Okay? Or dasha, sorry. Then the antardasha of any grahas that join Rahu or Ketu in the Rashi chart. So conjunctions of Rahu or Ketu in the Rashi chart. Those will be extremely important as well. Okay? And examine those planets and Rahu in all the vargas that are going to be important. Okay? Then, in Rahu Dasha, Rahu Saturn is going to be important because Rahu gives the effects of Saturn. So whatever Saturn's indicating in the chart is going to happen in a huge way in Rahu Saturn. Okay, so look at that. Look at that in every important varga that you have any concerns about. Okay. Then in Rahu Dasha, Rahu Venus is usually the turnaround period. It's usually the period of biggest changes and shifts in Rahu Dasha, 90% of the time. Okay. So you always know that Rahu Venus is going to be important. It's usually, unfortunately, a tragic period. On rare occasions, it'll be an amazingly surprising period, meaning the unexpected happens, that's great. Most often it's a period of tragedy. Sometimes it's a tragic period that also has something beneficial to give. But you have to study Rahu-Venus periods extremely carefully. You're also going to find in Rahu-Venus period is where people tend to get the most confused and distraught about their life. So extremely important to study Rahu-Venus periods always. In Ketu Dasha, Ketu Mars is going to be important because Ketu gives the effects of Mars. So always study that in any important vargas, okay? And K2 will give the full force, full impact of Mars's effects in K2 Mars. Then in K2 Dasha, K2 Jupiter can potentially be a very enlightening and happiness-producing period. It can be a very lucky, surprisingly lucky period where a lot of good karmic merit flows through into a person's life. Okay? Now, of course, if K2 is in really bad shape, K2 Jupiter can't be wonderful. Okay? But still, it might let a little bit good through, even if K2 is otherwise very dismal. So look for K2 Jupiter to be either a fantastic time where some really fortunate things happen for the person, or a period where they at least get a little bit of help with whatever's been burdening them in the K2 Dasha. Okay? And potentially those periods, K2 Jupiter, can be very good for knowledge, spirituality, and things like that. Rahu Venus Dasha is sort of the polar opposite of K2 Jupiter. Rahu Venus tends to be disruptive most of the time, and oftentimes Rahu Venus, when it is good, is materially really rewarding. So sometimes people hit instant fame in Rahu Venus or become a millionaire in Rahu Venus, strange things like that. K2 Jupiter can sometimes do financial successes, but oftentimes it's just a more mental and emotional period as well. So both those periods are Rahu Venus and K2 Jupiter can be very important. So you want to pay attention to those. Okay? Then, when you look at these antardashas, you want to examine them in light of the Lajitadi Avastas of the Antardasha Lord. So in K2 Jupiter, a person needs to study Jupiter and see how it's doing. And also, of course, see how Jupiter is related to K2. In K2 Mars, a person just needs to focus on Mars. Whatever its Lajitadi Avasta, whatever it's doing is going to happen. Okay? Rahu Venus, you want to focus on Venus's Lajitadi Avasta, but also Venus's relationship to Rahu. In Rahu Saturn, you just want to focus on Saturn is Lajitadi Avastas. Rahu is going to give the full force of Saturn. Okay? Then, of course, in the Antardasha of Rahu or Ketu's Lord, it's the Lajitadi Avasta of its Lord that's going to be the determinative factor. And also its sign position from the Lagna, all those types of things, which are all part of what we learned in the Lajitadi Avastas course. And the Antardasha of the Grahas joining Rahu and Ketu, those are going to be important, and they're going to be good or bad in accordance with their Lajitadi Avastas. Okay? Now that's going to take care of, in the Rashi chart, that'll take care of 2, maybe 3 or 4 of the Antardashas of Rahu. And of course, if we include the Vargas, you're going to find every Antardasha has something important to give in respect to Rahu and Ketu. Okay? But when you're looking at any one single Varga, say the Rashi Varga or anything else, in the other Antardashas, besides these 6 Antardashas that I mentioned as being really important ones, Rahu or Ketu are just going to sort of give their own effects. They're just going to try to maintain things that these other Antardashas create and do to them. They'll just try to hold on for the best that they can, make things work as best as possible. And how they'll do that depends on the influences to them, the aspects and conjunctions to them. Are they aspected and joined by planets in good dignities? If so, that makes Rahu and Ketu have the capability, intelligence, ability to keep things moving along nicely. If they're aspected by planets in bad dignities, then those planets in bad dignity are going to indicate weaknesses in their capacity and abilities that will cause Rahu and Ketu to make lots of mistakes, and so things will sort of fall apart more in Rahu and Ketu period. Then are Rahu and Ketu joined or aspected by planets that rule the good houses from the ascendant, such as the 1st, 5th, and 9th Rashis from the ascendant? If that's the case, then Rahu and Ketu will just have a little more luck and fortune and focus that will help them maintain. On the other hand, if they're aspected by the evil house lords, the 3rd, 6th, and 11th, for instance, then there's going to be less emphasis on maintaining those things. So a person, say, may get married in the dasha of Rahu and the antardasha of, say, the ninth lord joining Rahu. But after that, it may go into the antardasha of the third lord, who's not really focused on anything but its own business. So then after marriage, a person might start focusing on their own things and not really pay a lot of attention to the marriage, which happens quite a lot. So that antardasha of one of those evil lords is going to, or if Rahu and Ketu are aspected by evil lords, then when they're not activating one of these specific planets, are just going to sort of drift apart, drift downwards, and not really focus on what's been created. And those ups and downs will happen in the antardashas of those other planets. But those are all secondary influences. They're not as critical as these times. If you can just figure out these times of Rahu and Ketu, you're going to predict the huge things that are going to happen in Rahu and Ketu dasha. The other things, just Rahu and Ketu in general, those will just be Rahu and Ketu holding on to the things that these other planets have done. And so it's not as important, but you want to watch it, because lots of times a person won't be able to hold on to it, or the woman will come in or the husband will come in and say, things were great, but 6 months after marriage, my spouse all of a sudden has this new hobby and is focusing on this old thing, all these other things, and we're not spending a lot of time together. And you look and you see, and they've gone into the antardasha of the third lord. And so Rahu, which married them, is no longer getting, is no longer partner-centered. It's more third house-centered. So the person wants to pursue his own interests. So, but those are secondary influences, but well worth watching. Okay? Now, if you have the time, it's always good to look at what Rahu's doing in every Varga and find those good, important antardashas that are going to really kick things in. But there's a way we can kind of see which Vargas are really probably going to be the most important. And those are going to be the Vargas that are sort of pointed towards in the Rashi chart. So remember, the Rashi chart is the path that you're on, basically. It's the path, the road that you're traveling. And as a person's on that path, they're going to be directed towards the 7th house, 2nd house, whatever planets are being activated in the Rashi chart. And so those, the bhavas and karakas along that path that are getting activated, those are the ones we really want to focus on in the Vargas. Those are the Vargas we always want to look at first. Same with Rahu and Ketu. So, it says, examine the Vargas that relate to the Bhava cusp that Rahu or Ketu may join. So if Rahu joins the second Bhava cusp, then you need to look at the Hora chart, the Varga for the second house, for sure during Rahu Dasha. It has to be a priority Varga for you to examine. Okay? If Rahu's in the first house and conjunct the first and second Varga, first and second cusp, you have to really focus on Hora and Rashi. Okay? And Trim Samsha. Anytime the first house gets activated, study the Trim Samsha as well. So, whatever cusp are getting activated by Rahu or Ketu in the Rashi, look to the Vargas that are important to those cusps. Okay? Then say Rahu's in the third Rashi from the ascendant. Well, then still take the time to look at the Vargas that relate to the third Rashi, which are namely the Drekana for siblings and the Vamsha or 27th Varga for strengths and weaknesses. That one won't be usually as crucial to look at as the house cusp indicated Varga, but you still want to look at it. Okay, because you don't want to miss anything that could be important in Rahu or Ketu Dasha. Okay? Then pay attention to the Vargas that relate to any Karakas that Rahu or Ketu may join. So, if Rahu's conjunct Jupiter, which is children, pay attention to the Saptamsha, and also to the Hora, which is wealth. Okay? If Rahu or Ketu are joined Venus, then pay a lot of attention to the Navamsha, the Varga for marriage. Pay a lot of attention to the Shodamsha, the Varga of vehicles, and so on. If it's conjunct the moon, which is, a mother planet, pay a lot of attention to the health of the mother in the Trimsamsha chart, and also the parental influence in the Dwadasamsha chart. Okay, so whatever the karaka is, look in that chart. If it's conjunct Saturn, pay a lot of attention to the Dasamsha, the chart of great fruits and also great responsibilities, where Saturn's a really important planet. And also pay attention to the 30th Varga, the Trimsamsha, for possible health problems that they may have. Okay? And also, if it's conjunct Mars, pay a lot of attention to the Trimsamsha for possible accidents. Okay? So whatever the karaka is, look in the appropriate Varga. If it's Jupiter or Mercury, you can also pay attention to the education Varga, the Varga of knowledge, which is the 24th Varga, the Chaturvimsamsha, or the Siddhamsha. In that chart, Mercury is more formal, regulated education, whereas Jupiter is simply knowledge. Okay? Okay. Then the next thing is, after the karaka ships, examine the Vargas that relate to any Bhavakas lords that Rahu or Ketu may join. So say Rahu's joined the lord of the 4th Bhavakas, then pay a lot of attention to the Vargas relating to the 4th Varga, which is mother's health, okay, the Trimsamsha, your mother's parental influence, which is the Dwadasamsha, vehicles, which is the Shodamsha, and also pay attention to the Chaturtamsha, the chart for fortune and property, the 4th Varga. Okay? So whatever house lord, cusp lords, conjunct Rahu or Ketu, pay attention to the Vargas that relate to those. Then, same thing but based on Rashi lords. Examine the Vargas that relate to any Rashi lords as counted from the Lagna that Rahu or Ketu may join. So say you have a Scorpio Lagna and Rahu's conjunct Saturn. Saturn rules the 3rd and 4th Rashis from the ascendant. So look at Vargas relating to the 3rd and 4th. Okay, Drakana for 3rd, Bamsha for 3rd, Chaturtamsha for 4th, and so on. Okay, so that way you really can easily see which Vargas which areas of life are Rahu and Ketu really ready to shift, and then you want to study those areas in the Vargas really carefully. Then in Rahu Dasha, you always want to look at the Saptamsha for children and the Navamsha for marriage. The reason you do that is because Rahu has a particular affinity for giving children and marriage regardless of what it's doing in the Rashi chart. It's a dasha that's notorious for giving children and marriage. In fact, you're going to find most children are born in Rahu Dasha, more than any other Dasha. And more than any other Dashas, marriages happen more in Rahu Dasha than any other Dasha. Believe it or not. Okay? So pay attention to that. Then in Ketu Dasha, you always want to keep a close eye out for property-related things. Okay? Ketu is a particular planet that has to do with property, and especially long-term ownership of property. You'll find more people get inheritances of property in Ketu Dasha than any other Dasha. So if Ketu Dasha is up, study that Chaturtamsha for property possibilities. Okay? So that'll help you, focus on what's important, what you really need to focus on during that Dasha of Rahu and Ketu. After you've covered all that, chances are you're going to have covered whatever the client is there for, but you can still may want to look at other Vargas if you want to see more. But that's what you really need to focus on. Okay? So those are your basic directions for predicting Rahu and Ketu's effects. And we're going to start doing videos with example charts of Rahu and Ketu